In this video, we're going to dive into the Django-components package, and this is a package that allows you to build reusable template components in Django. And this will work well if you are building a website or an application that uses the Django templates, and potentially if you're building something that uses HTMX or another hypermedia package. Now, the components that you build, they encapsulate the HTML, the JavaScript and CSS for some kind of front-end UI component, and then you can share that component from one Django project into potentially unlimited amounts of projects. So that's the idea behind the reusability of these components. And in this video, we're going to build our own. We're going to see how to build a card component using this package. Now, before we start, I want to highlight this coffee page that I have open here. I'm planning to release a Django REST framework course in the near future, and I would like to release this course on YouTube if possible. But I'm also considering releasing these on a platform such as Udemy. But if there's sufficient interest in this coffee page and we reach that $1,000 donation target, I'm going to release this for free on YouTube. And that would be my preference rather than going down the route of releasing this on Udemy. So if you're interested, feel free to donate on this page. We've got a link in the description. And if you're watching the video, give it a thumbs up. It would help the content a lot. And let's get started. So let's start by looking at the Django components GitHub page. And you can see that here on the right hand side, we have the About section. This package will allow you to create simple reusable template components in Django. And if we scroll down just to the README section, what this is going to allow you to do is create template components. And these components, they contain the template, which is the HTML code, as well as any JavaScript and CSS that's needed to generate the front-end code that you need for a modern application. So Django components allows you to bundle all of those into what's called a component. And then you can render those components in your templates using the component template tag provided by this package. And you can see here, a component has a name, and it also has some dynamic values that you can pass into the component that customize what's shown in the component when it's actually rendered. Now, this declaration of a component gets translated into some code that's then rendered on the page, and that will be HTML with some CSS and the JavaScript that are specified in that component. We're going to learn how to build a component in this video, and if you're interested in other good practices for Django templates, we did a video on that should be appearing on the screen now, and that would be a good introduction to some of these concepts that we're going to follow in this video. However, note that it isn't essential to watch that, so feel free to check that out. We're going to go to the table of contents. Now, one of these is some security notes. We're going to come back to that right at the end of this video, but let's now go to the installation section of this README. Now, the starting point here is to install Django components into a Python virtual environment. So I'm going to copy the pip install command, and I'm going to open up VS Code. And at the bottom here, as you can see, we have a terminal open, and we have a Python environment activated. We're going to paste in the pip install command, and that's going to install Django components into that environment. We can then clear the terminal, and I'm going to minimize that, and we're going to look at settings.py in order to set up Django components. Now, what I have here is a super simple Django project. It's not too far off the start project code that's generated automatically. What I'm going to do is go down to installed apps, and the first thing we need to do after installing Django components is to add it to installed apps. You can see that here in the README. I'm going to copy this, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and just underneath the core application, we're going to add Django components. And once we've added that to installed apps, we're going to go back to the README, and there's a couple of extra steps. From the templates setting, we need to remove this one here. So I'm going to go back to VS Code, and let's go down to templates and remove the app directories setting. Now, what is that setting doing? If we go back to the Django documentation, this app directories template setting will determine whether the Django templating engine should look for source files inside of the installed applications. So we are removing that setting from the template setting, and what we also need to do is add the options.loaders setting. So I'm going to copy these loaders here that are defined, and we're going to add these to the templating options. So let's go back to VS Code, and under options we have some context processors, but we're also going to add these loaders, and the last one in this list here is the one that comes from Django components. Now, after we've done that, there's one final step here. We need to add the static files directories setting. So let's copy what's here, and we're going to go back to VS Code. I'm going to go down to near the bottom where we have the static URL, and I'm going to paste this in, and we can fix this reference here. Now, the base directory in modern Django applications is a pathlib object, so we can remove os.path.join, And we can refer to a directory called components that we're going to create in a second as that static files directory. Now notice here that we're telling the Django static files application to look in a folder called components in order to find the JavaScript, CSS and so on resources. So what we're going to do on the left hand side at the project root is create a new folder, and we're going to call this folder components. So we've created that now, and just to avoid confusion, the components demo folder, that is the Django project folder that contains the settings and the URLs. The components folder is where we are going to store the components that we're going to create using the Django components package. And I've just realized how much I've said the word components in that last sentence. We're now going to build a simple component to demonstrate how to do this using this package. But if you're interested in more complex components, or perhaps components that use htmx, just let me know in the comments. I am quite interested in building some more videos on this package. What we're going to do in this video though is assume that we want to standardize the cards that we're going to display in this particular website or application. So what I've opened here is the DaisyUI card component, and we're going to base the styles for this card on what's provided by DaisyUI. Now to start with, what we're going to do is install DaisyUI and TailwindCSS, because that's the CSS framework that DaisyUI relies on. So what we're going to do is copy these CDN links, and we're going to paste them into base.html. So let's paste them into the head tag. And this is the base template for this simple project that we have. So by adding them there, we're going to have access to DaisyUI styles and components in this application. Now, once we've added that, what we can do is we can start building the component. So let's go back to the GitHub page for Django components. And I'm going to go down to this section on creating our first component. Now we have a sample structure here of an application. And what we can see is the components directory in the project that we've just created. And within that, we have a subdirectory for any components that we want to create. So in this example, we're creating a component for a calendar. And within that directory, we have 4 potential files. So we have a Python file here, and that's what ties the component together with some Python code. We also have an HTML file that defines the markup for the component, as well as optionally some CSS and JavaScript. The CSS is obviously for styling the component, and if we need any interactivity, we can use JavaScript in order to build that in. Now we're going to create a card, so what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to go to the components directory, which is currently empty, and we're going to create a new component directory called card. And within that, we're going to create 2 files. So let's start by creating template.html, and that's going to contain the markup for this component. And we're also going to create the Python file, and that's going to be called card.py. So let's start by building the markup for this card. Let's go to template.html, and we're going to go back to the DaisyUI documentation. And what I'm going to do is go back to this card page here. So let's go back a couple. Now you can see the classes that you can use here to define the card. We have the parent card class, and that defines a card component. That's a container element in DaisyUI. We also have card title and body, and these allow you to define the title and the body of the card, and so on. We're going to scroll down and we can see what one of these cards might look like. So here we have a card that has a border around it, and we have an image in the title, and the body contains a header and a paragraph. And then we have a button here that's kind of like a call to action. And in this case, this could be an e-commerce website, and this would allow you to buy the product. And we could have a card for the different items that we're selling on that e-commerce site. Now we're going to keep it simple in this video, so I'm going to scroll down and we're going to find one of these cards that doesn't have an image. And that's mostly because I'm quite lazy and I can't be bothered adding an image field to the Django model or anything like that. What we're going to do is we're going to copy the HTML for this simple card that contains only a title. So I'm going to copy all of this, and we're going to go back to the template.html and paste that in here. Now later on, we're going to make some of these dynamic values that you can pass into the component, but for now, let's keep them hard-coded. Once we have the HTML, we're going to go to card.py, and we're going to write the Python code to define this Django component. Now let's go back to the README for Django components, and we're going to look at the sample Python component here. I think it's easier to view in VS Code, so what I'm going to do is just copy paste this into card.py, and we're going to look at the code now. At the top, from the Django components package, we are importing the component, and then we define a Python class. It's called calendar here, but I'm going to override that and call it card, and that will inherit from the component class from this package. Now we register a named component. I'm going to call this component card, and then we provide the template name for that particular component. So our template is in a directory called card, and it's called template.html. So we need to change this and reference the correct HTML for this component. And a component class can also take context data, and that's defined in a getContextData method, and that's very similar to the convention on Django class-based views. For now, we don't actually need this, so I'm going to remove it. And we also have a media class in the component that points to the CSS and JavaScript files for that component. For now, we're going to remove this, but we will define these later on. So we have a very simple component here, and we are inheriting from a component class, and we are pointing towards the HTML for that component. Once we've defined it, how do we actually use this component? What we have in this project is, as well as a base template, an index.html file. Now at the moment, this is a very simple template. It just says hello. What we're going to do is run the Django server with the run server command. And then we're going to go to the page, and you can see hello appearing at the top left here. So not the most exciting page you've ever seen. But let's now learn how we can add the component onto this page and display the card from DaisyUI. So I'm going to go back to the README for Django components, and I'm going to scroll down to this section on using them in Django templates. Now what we need to do to start with is use the load component tags directive, and we need to add that to our templates. So I'm going to go back to index.html at the top here. We're going to add the load directive. So underneath the extends template tag, we can add load component tags. And then underneath our hello statement, we're going to use the component template tag from this package, and we render a named component. And remember, we registered this with the name of card. So we're going to render that, and then we can add the end component. And that allows us to very simply define this component called card, and hopefully that's going to render on the page. So now if everything is set up correctly, we can go back to our application, and when we refresh the page, you can see we now get the card appearing on the page. And this is good because it allows us to very easily render cards within our template, so we can copy and paste as many of these as we like, and go back to the application, and you can see them appearing top to bottom on the page. And if you wanted them to appear on the horizontal axis from left to right, we could wrap these components within a div, for example, and give that div a class of flex from TailwindCSS. And then we can tab over these components and end the div below. And by giving this the class of flex, it's going to position these cards from left to right along the row axis by default. So when we refresh this page, you can see they are now appearing from left to right. For the purposes of Django components, we've encapsulated everything in a component called card, and we can very easily structure these cards on the page by using tools like Flexbox. Now, often it will be important to pass custom information or custom data into the cards that we're showing here. If we look at the three of these at the moment, they are rendering out nicely, but they contain exactly the same information, which is not ideal. Now your custom data that you want to show, it might come from APIs or it might come from your database. So you might be fetching data from the database and using Django models and query sets to display that on the page. In that case, we can't hard code all the information. We need to pass data into these components somehow. So that's what we're going to learn how to do now. What we can do is go back to VS Code and go to card.py, and we're going to go to this class that defines our component. Now earlier on we got rid of getContextData, so we're going to bring that back now. And this is a method on the component, so it's going to take self as a parameter, but it's also going to take any data that you want to pass into the component. So what we're going to pass in to start with is a title for the card. So let's give it a parameter of title here, and we can return a Python dictionary, and that can contain keys that you can map to different values. So we're going to map the title key to a value that we're passing in here called title. And then we can go back to index.html where we have our three components. And to each one of these, I'm going to pass in a title, and that's a piece of data that will determine the title that should be shown. So we're just going to give it very simple titles here of title 1, title 2, and you guessed it, title 3. And there's one final step here in order to render that title on our card. We need to go back to the markup, the HTML for the card. And what we're going to do here is we're going to remove this hard-coded title, and we're going to use Django's syntax here to refer to a dynamic title value that we're passing into this component. So this is no longer hard-coded, This should now be coming from the data that we're passing in here, and you can think of this as being somewhat similar to props that you pass in a React component. So if you're rendering a child component in a React application, you can actually pass props in there to pass data down to that component. I know some people don't like React, but that's just a simple comparison here. What we're doing is passing data into our component, and we can then accept that and render it out here within the component's HTML. So let's now try this out. We're going to go back to our page, and I'm going to refresh this page. And you can see now the titles on the card have changed. We have title 1, 2, and 3 respectively on each one of these cards. Now, as well as the title, we might of course want to customize the body as well as the text that appears in the button here. So I'm going to do that now as well. We're going to go back to card.py. As well as a title, we're going to accept a body, and let's also accept some button text. And we can actually provide default values here. So let's say the default value is buy now. Once we've added these parameters, we can add them to the context. So I'm going to add the body, and I'm also going to copy the button text here and add that to our context. Once we've added the context dictionary, we can go back to index.html, and now our component is expecting these pieces of data from the context. So let's add a body to these. For the first one, we'll just add body 1, and we're going to copy these to the two below. So now each one of these components has a body 1, 2, and 3 respectively. If we go back to card.py, we also have the button text. That's also part of the context, but notice that that does have the default value. And because it has that default, we don't need to pass that data into the component. So if we go back to template.html, what we're going to do is replace these hard-coded values again. In the paragraph tag, we're going to reference the body, and then we can reference the button text here, where we have the button. So that's button_text. We can save the HTML for this component. And we're now going to go back to the browser and refresh this page. And we can see the body that's appearing has body 1, 2, and 3, and all of the buttons have that default of buy now. So if we wanted to change the button text, we could also do that. Let's go back to index.html, and to the top component here, I'm going to pass the button text in as some data. If we then save that and go back to this page, you can see that the first button here now has different text of click here, whereas the other two say buy now, as they did before. That's the default value for that button text. So we're now building up our component, and we're allowing it to accept dynamic data that we're passing in. And again, as I said before, that data would typically come from the models that you have in your Django application. So coming from the database or coming from an API or a cache. So you can then take that data and you can pass it into your components, and that's going to render based on the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you define for that component. Now let's move on, and we're going to see now how we can add custom styles and JavaScript to these components in order to further customize how they behave and how they look. So we're going to keep this very simple. What we're going to do is we're going to change the background color of each of these cards, and we're going to do that by using some custom CSS. Let's go back to VS Code. What we can also do within the card component directory is define a CSS style sheet. So I'm going to call this style.css. And we're going to define a class called card background gradient. Now what this is going to do is it's going to define a background, and that's going to be a linear gradient. So we're going to define a very simple and perhaps unattractive linear gradient between the colours blue and red, and that's going to be the background that we want for the card. So let's copy the name of the class and go to our card component template. And within this template, what we're going to do is we're going to remove this background color of background base 100, and I'm going to paste in this new CSS class that we've added called card background gradient. So we want this to change the background color that we see here on the card, and if we refresh the page, we're going to see that that does not work by default. And the reason for that is because we need to actually tell Django-components to load in our static assets, our CSS files, within the head tag of our Django template. So at the moment, basically Django-components knows nothing about this style.css. So in order to tell it about that, we need to do a couple of different things. The first thing we need to do is go back to our component class that we've called card. And remember from earlier on, the copy-pasted code had a media subclass. And I think the correct term is actually, it's a nested class, not a subclass. So we have a media nested class here, similar to the meta class in a Django model or form. And within that, we can define a CSS property, and we're going to point that to our CSS file. So that's in the card directory within components, and it's style.css that we called that. Once we've done that, we can go back to the documentation, and in order to use the components and the templates along with some static assets, what we can do is we can add component CSS dependencies into the head tag. So let's go back to the base template of this project, and just underneath the script tag to load in Tailwind, I'm going to paste that component CSS dependencies template tag from Django components. And then if we go back to our page here, I'm going to refresh this page, and you can see we're getting an error here, an invalid block tag called component CSS dependencies. Did you forget to register or load this tag? Yes, I did. So let's go back to the template here. And because this is a tag that's defined by Django components, we need to actually tell this template base.html about that. We can copy what we provided here in index.html. That's the load component tags directive. And we're going to paste that at the top here. And that's then going to allow us to use this within the base template. So let's now save that and go back to the page. And when we refresh this page, you can see we now have this amazing looking linear gradient as a background color for our card. Now I'm going to try changing this a little bit. So let's go back to the CSS file. I've defined this very randomly, and it turns out a linear gradient from blue to red with no other parameters doesn't look particularly good in this card. So let's try changing it to something else. Rather than blue to red, let's try from grey. And what could we put for the second one here? Instead of red, let's put silver in here and see what happens when we do that. Not the most scientific approach to a linear gradient, but when we do that, it's not looking ideal, but it's certainly better than it was before. So that's how to embed styles in the component. What we do is we define a style sheet that we can put in the component directory, and then we refer to that within the media nested class and point to that style sheet. Now what we're also going to do is define a JavaScript file, and that allows us to add interactivity to our component. So within the card directory, I'm about to create a script.javascript file. So let's preemptively set that up here, and then I'm going to copy the name of this. Within the card directory, we'll add script.js, and here we can write the JavaScript that we need for whatever the component is that we're creating. Now one other thing we need to do, as well as adding JS to the media class, is we need to also add something to our HTML. You can see here component JS dependencies. So as well as CSS dependencies, we also need to declare this template tag from Django components. So let's copy that, and we're going to go back to base.html, and within the body, just below this div here with the content, I'm going to paste that in. So let's go back to script.js. We're going to write the JavaScript for our component here. If we go back to the page, what do we want to actually write here? This is a simple card, so we're just going to do this for demonstration purposes. But let's say when we click the button, whatever the button we click, we want to display an alert on the page. And that alert should contain, let's say, the text that's defined in the button. Now, how do we define the script? What we can do, if we go back to the documentation for Django components, there's a recommended pattern that's used here for your JavaScript file. So a good way to make sure your component doesn't clash with other components is to define all code inside what's called an anonymous function. And that anonymous function should call itself. And this is a pattern in JavaScript that allows you to basically avoid polluting the global namespace. And that's because it makes all variables that are defined only available inside the component, and it's not going to affect other components. So in order to define that anonymous function, what I'm going to do is copy this, and we're going to go back to script.js. I'm going to paste this in here and remove all of this code here. So to define that, we create a block here. We have a function that has no name, and here is the body of that function. And this is anonymous. We then call that function here, and basically anything that we define in here is going to be private to this block of code. So what we're going to do is get a reference to all of the buttons that we have in the component. We can use the query selector all method in order to do that, and we're going to get the buttons from the template. Once we have these buttons, we're going to add an event listener to each one of them. So buttons.forEach, and for each button that we get back on the page, we're going to define this callback function. And for each button, we're going to call add event listener. We're going to listen for the click event. And when we get that, we have an event being passed in here. What we're going to render here in an alert is simply the button's text content. So button.text content, that's going to be alerted to the page. So let's go over this one more time. We are getting a reference to all of the buttons on the page by calling document.querySelectorAll. And then for each one of these buttons, we're taking that button, we're adding a click event listener, and when the button is clicked, what's going to happen is defined in this callback function. We're going to alert the text content for that button when it's clicked. Now you can pass the event as an argument, but I'm not actually using that here, so I'm going to remove this from the callback function, and we're going to save the script, and we're going to go back to the page, and hopefully this is going to work. So let's go back to our page. I'm going to refresh this to load the new static assets. When we click this button, you can see an alert appearing, and this is quite small. I hope you can read that, but it does say click here. And when we click one of the other buttons, you can see it's got the text content from that particular button showing in the alert. And same for the last button on the page. So that's how you can customize the component that you're building and add interactivity to this component. And by bundling together the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript like this, what you can actually do with Django components is build reusable components that you can then perhaps take from one project and add it to another project. If we look at the documentation, what they've got here in this reference is a calendar. So you could build a calendar or some kind of date view, or even an accordion or something like that, or a card like we're building, and you can basically componentize that and bundle together everything you need for that particular component. And ideally you can then use that component in as many Django projects as you want. So it's the idea of building reusable components. All you need to do is define your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript, and you can think about the interface for what data needs to be passed into that component. For example, for a card, you might want a title, a body, perhaps an image, and so on. Now, before we finish, I did say we would touch upon the security section of this documentation, so I'm going to scroll up to the security section, and this section, you're advised to read this before you use Django components in production. So basically components, they can be organized however you want, but the preferred way is to keep the files of a component close together by bundling them in the same directory. And that's what we've done here. We've created a components directory, and we have one component called card, and all of the files that we need here for that component, and that's the JS, the CSS, and HTML files, as well as the Python file. They're all bundled together in that directory. So basically we're following that pattern, and it means that the files containing backend logic, such as Python modules and HTML templates, these live in the same directory as static files, for example, JavaScript and CSS files. Now, if you're using the static files application in Django to collect your static files, there is no distinction made between different kinds of files. So what happens then is that your Python code and templates might inadvertently become available on your static file server. And this is something you probably don't want. It will expose the code that you're using in Python for these components. So backend logic is going to become exposed, and that's certainly a potential security vulnerability. Now, as of version 0.27, which is quite a long time ago, Django components will now ship with an installable app, and that's called Safer Static Files, and the name says it all. This is a drop-in replacement for the static files app that comes out of the box in Django, and the behavior is 100% identical, but it will ignore Python and HTML files, so it's not going to collect those when you run the collect static command, and therefore Python files will not end up on your static file server, and neither will HTML files. So all we need to do is add this Safer Static Files to the installed apps. So I'm going to copy this, and we can go back to settings.py, and I'm going to go up to installed apps, and what we can do is comment out the default static files application in Django, and we're going to paste in Safer Static Files instead. And I need a comma here after Django components. Once we save this file, we can go back to our page, and everything should still look the same when we refresh this page, but we have this additional security consideration. We've taken that into account, and we're adding Safer Static Files to protect the Python and HTML files that we define for our component code. So that's just a security consideration, and it's very easy to mitigate that by adding Safer Static Files to installed apps. So that's all for this video. We've seen how to work with Django components in this video, and we can build reusable components and define HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together with a Python file in order to define the behavior, the styles, and the markup for these components. These are reusable. We can ship them off to as many applications as we want. And I think this is something that has a lot of potential in Django and something I want to use a lot more. And if you're interested, I'd like to build more videos on this topic. And I would also like to look at HTMX and how we could use Django components along with HTMX in order to build interactive applications. And one thing I did want to note on the README for Django components, there is a community examples section. And one of the goals of this package is to make it easy to share components between projects. Now we have a single reference here, and that's a set of components that you can use with HTMX, and that's called Django HTMX components. I'm going to click this, and this is a repository with 122 stars. I haven't tried this out yet, but I'm very interested to see what kind of components that they have. If you're interested and you want me to make a video on that, let me know in the comments. And as I said at the start of the video, if you're interested in a Django REST framework series on YouTube, it would be greatly appreciated to donate to this coffee campaign that I have. There's a link in the description. Thanks again for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next video.